We've had a wonderful first presentation, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the panel discussion, which I hope will be lively and active, as it always is at these college forums. Let me first introduce the panel members, and then we'll get into the meat of the discussion. Now, to my right is Stephanie Ryan, who's the MLA for Euroa, the member for Euroa. Now, Stephanie's especially welcome today because she's an ex-resident of this college, having completed a Bachelor of Communications in Journalism at RMIT while she was living here at college. She was motivated, I gather, to move into politics by her family's farm experience of drought and the then government's failed promise to bring a water pipeline over the Great Divide. So there's a motivating factor there which has led to great things. She has worked as a senior advisor to the Nationals leader Peter Ryan and to Premier Ted Baillieu, and she stood successfully at the last state election for the new seat of Euroa. She was elected also Deputy Leader of the Nationals in Victoria and is Shadow Minister for Youth Affairs and for Training, Skills and Apprenticeship. Stephanie, you're most welcome today. Dr. Nicholas Gruen on my further right is what you might call an alternative economist. He may disagree with my statement later, but he's not cut in the usual mould. He is Chair of Lateral Economics, the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, the Open Knowledge Foundation and Deakin University's Arts Participation Incubator. I gather he's also just been appointed to one of the boards of the new body Creative Arts Victoria. He's advised Cabinet Ministers. He sat on what is now called the Productivity Commission. He chaired the internationally acclaimed Government 2.0 Task Force. Nicholas is also patron of the Australian Digital Alliance. He's supported several very innovative startups, and for his pains is also a council member of the National Library of Australia. Would you welcome Nicholas? To my left, I'll start with Jack next to Sally here. Jack's a relative newcomer to Australia. He has worked in the United Kingdom and several other countries around the world to empower people, often through the internet, to help them shape their own future in the health system through community organisations, in particular to help young people engage more fully in the democratic process. Jack has worked for the UK National Institute for Health Research, is currently in Australia working for the World Health Organization and the Cochrane Collaboration. Perhaps most interestingly for our purposes today, Jack stood for election as an MP in the British House of Commons as a candidate for the Pirate Party UK, which is part of an international movement to uphold human rights, a party which already holds several parliamentary seats across Europe. So he's not just a pirate, he may look like one. Dr. Sally, would you welcome Jack as well? And Dr. Sally Young has been one of our most admired journalists and academics and media columnists for many years. She has a current monthly column in The Age, which we read with great interest every time. She is a Professor at Melbourne and currently an ARC Research Fellow, Associate Professor and Reader in Political Science at the University of Melbourne. And her future fellowship focuses on the power of the press in Australia. Dr. Young has published several books on government and communication processes, the latest being a book called How Australia Decides, Election Reporting and the Media. She brings with her immense knowledge of how voting and the constant polling and repolling of public opinion is affected by both the old media and the new media. Would you welcome Dr. Sally Young? And of course we have Dr. Simon Longstaff, who's already raised so many issues for us to discuss, and I'd like to just thank him again for the wonderful speech. Now, there are many ways in which we could start the discussion, but I want to start with a question from Mitch Stent, who's a college student here, because it addresses one of the central themes of Simon's presentation. And Mitch, would you like to ask your question. There's a microphone coming there.
So the question I wanted to ask, Dr. Longstaff, you already spoke quite profoundly and insightfully to it in your address, which I'm very grateful for. But I would like to open up the question to the panel. The credibility of Australian politicians has come under serious scrutiny on both the domestic and international stages in recent years. So much so that it seems a rift has opened between politicians and those they stand to represent, being the public or the governed. Firstly, how might this issue of political integrity and accountability be addressed? And secondly, could structural changes such as non-compulsory voting and longer terms be viable to renew the onus on politicians to be accountable for engaging the public in our democratic process?
Okay, so let's start with Stephanie, who's just been elected, and a comment about the legitimacy and compulsory voting, whether there are other ways, how do we restore that sort of legitimacy?
I must say I found Simon's statistics from the Lowy Institute very interesting, that I think it was 40% of people between the ages of 18 and 40 are only partially engaged in politics. I do think that the system of compulsory voting is important, primarily because I think it drives people to actually engage and give some consideration to how they see the future of our country. Now, perhaps they will vote informally, but at least it's a conscious decision to vote informally in most cases, I would suggest. So firstly, I think that that's a fundamental plank of our system, and one that I would strongly advocate to be retained. I guess on the question of legitimacy, I do believe that, and I think Simon addressed it very well, that politicians do face issues of trust, and how we address that in the modern world, which is changed quite dramatically by particularly that relationship between the media and politics and the advent of new media, is a very challenging one, and one that I must admit I don't immediately have the answer to.
Thanks. Jack, do you want to comment just from the British point of view why you thought it necessary and interesting to stand for the Parliament?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think first of all, in the UK we don't have compulsory voting, and I remember when I learned that Australia did. I found that really interesting. And I think the idea that, you picked up on the words accountability as well. And I think, it was mentioned by Simon as well, the idea of a conscience vote, voting for your conscience rather than other influences, that may be financial. And I think the perception in the UK, as in Australia, is that, there is, as you say, this rift between the things that are actually being done, the direction people are actually going, and the things that are being said. Just very briefly on my personal motivations to stand, it was something I felt strongly about, human rights online being eroded, civil liberties. I didn't feel was part of the public discourse, so I thought, well, I'll stand in a safe seat where I know I'll lose and I'll absolutely have no chance of getting in whatsoever. It was an interesting experience, but quite disheartening at the same time. So I think I'd just finally go back to the most important word, I think, which is accountability, and how you sort of uphold that and go back to Simon's really important point of this conscience vote. If we don't perceive people as acting in everyone's interest, in the public's interest, then you lose that legitimacy. And I think, the new media, the internet, gives us amazing new ways to do this. And we're using a system that was, that predates the printing press and all these things. Is it really the best system? Can we improve it? Probably. How? Well, let's have a discussion. So I welcome this chance today. It's a wonderful forum to discuss this.
Thank you. Sally, you've done a lot of studies of voting, polling, public opinion and so on. Where you have voluntary voting, as in the United States, you only have 54% of the public voting in a presidential election. In the UK, you've got first past the post voting, which is another system altogether. I wonder what you think about the public's response to legitimacy and accountability.
Yeah, I definitely don't think that voluntary voting is the answer, and I know that it was recently proposed by Mark Latham, which might say it all perhaps, that if we move to non-compulsory or voluntary voting, if you want to call it that, that might engage the electorate more. And all I say is look to the United States. Exactly. I mean, 50% of the population votes. Politicians know that the people who come out to vote on a Tuesday, usually during working hours, are the affluent, the educated, older white Americans. They know that. They can design policy on that basis, and they do, which is why you get, working class Americans appalled that there might be public health care introduced. I mean, you just couldn't understand it in any other way except for saying this is a system that's set up that way. And I applaud that other people on this panel. In Australia, we are very fortunate that we have a pretty broad spectrum of political support for compulsory voting. It's one of the best features of our system. If people aren't engaged, it's not because of that, it's despite that. And we need to make sure that our system actually is set up to enforce it. One of the biggest problems at the moment with compulsory voting is that young people are not registering to vote. So we've got at least 1 million people missing off the rolls. That is a problem. We have compulsory voting. We need to make sure the system works, but undoing it is, in my mind, far from a solution for getting more people engaged. I think terrible things would flow from that.
Nicholas, your comment on it, this accountability, legitimacy voting issue.
Yeah, well, certainly on compulsory voting, one way, in fact, I don't often, I agree with what Simon said earlier, that you don't too often want to bring economic metaphors into questions of politics. I think here quite a useful one can be made, which is that one of the most undemocratic things you can do is have a poll tax to tax people for the right to vote. And you can think of compulsory voting, which is not compulsory voting, it's compulsory attendance at the polling booths, as a negative poll tax. Voting is inconvenient. It makes no rational sense for anyone to vote because of, if you consider the chances that they will actually have a material impact on the result, it's infinitesimal. The engine behind democracy is not therefore reason and self-interest, but affect and expression, which I might talk about a bit later. But on the question of this inconvenience tax that we impose, what that does is it imposes a negative poll tax, where a poll tax of, say, $100 to vote would be an active discrimination against the least pecunious of our community, the least wealthy of our community, an obligation and a flat fine for not attending the polling booths has the opposite effect. Its greatest effect is on the least wealthy, and so it's a powerfully inclusive mechanism, and it is not in any sense it's not in any sense coercive in the political sense, because you don't have to vote, you have to attend. So I'm strongly in favour of it on those grounds, and on the grounds of the kinds of results that it produces, which Sally has been kind enough to point out by contrasting it with the United States. The other thing I'd like to do is to draw attention to some of the background presumptions of the question, if you like. Because essentially what's happening is where I sense that democracy is being cast in a purchaser-provider model in our heads. The producers and the consumers. The producers of democracy are the politicians, and we're the consumers, and we're not happy with the product. I think that's in many ways an unfortunate turn in our thinking about democracy. And there's plenty of time for me to develop some of those ideas, but I guess I'll just finish by saying that another characteristic of this is that the consumer's supposed to be always right, but the consumer buys the product from the producer. The consumer makes a choice. Every criticism you have of democracy you should also reflect on the extent to which it is a criticism of us, we the people, and our conduct.
Yeah, I'd like the panel to expand on that a bit. Is choice really freedom? That's the argument always about, say, children's television programs that Trish has been involved with. They'll watch anything, but is that choice? If they don't have quality programs to watch, they have no choice, actually. So in a democracy, is just the notion of choice, is that really freedom? It has to be informed choice, surely. Simon, do you want to just comment?
I'm trying to answer the question first, if I may. 2 points I'd make. Firstly, I support compulsory turning up. And I do so for different reasons, partly because I think as citizens there are very few things we do collectively, just as an obligation as being a citizen. We're asked, very little is asked of us. And this is one thing, and I think it's a great thing that happens, that we all go along together. The other thing is just to, and I know that Nicholas will expand on this, on this point about the consumption and producer, I had a fascinating conversation with one of the members of the Cabinet in New South Wales who proudly said to me, it's fantastic, I've set everything up in my portfolio so that everybody is treated as a consumer. A customer, that's right. I said, I'm not a customer. He said, what? He said, I'm a citizen. He said, well, what's the difference? And I said, well, the difference is that, and that's the point I started with earlier on this morning, that I am the person from whom the authority comes. I'm not your customer. I am the person. And then the implications of that for us to take responsibility is important. I think then, the point I made, to go to your question of choice, if you volunteer to be a politician, Steph volunteered and others have in a long tradition, you've got to do so with a sense of the responsibility that entails. It's not that you just say, I volunteer to be in the machine. I think there are certain kind of implications that politics imposes. I didn't mention it, but in Aristotle's work, politics and ethics are two sides of the one coin. Ethics was about what is the good life for the person. Politics was supposed to be what is a good life for a community. And they were always fused together, and they've somehow or other been separated.
Any other comments, Jim?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting discussion. The freedom question, I'm always reminded of George Orwell in 1984, freedom is slavery, and all these other Orwellian contradictions. Perhaps I'll return to George Orwell. But the word consumer is a word I'm going to pick up on, and I'm going to speak from my experience of working in health, public health, and I think health is probably the issue where democracy gets most focused for me, where it really is that balancing of everyone's needs. We have a finite number of resources, whether you measure that in money or people or what have you. We can only do so much, though there are limitations there. Yet in Australia, they use the language of consumers to describe everyone in this room who's going to die of something. We don't know what it is yet, but we've all got an interest in our public health system, in our research, yet we're called consumers. I don't think that word for me implies an equal partnership or one where everyone's, holding up consumerism and the market model as the best model we have. I don't think works in health. I mean, a lot of health choices, it's a bit like the Model T Ford, you can have any colour you like as long as it's black. It's a bit like that with, you've got a lot of choice as long as it's your local hospital or your local GP. You're limited to those. So to use the word consumer, I think reinforces an unequal relationship. And so the work I do, I describe as public involvement. I don't use the word citizen involvement because I'm not a citizen. I'm here as a migrant. So it's, in all the language, who are we unconsciously excluding? And who are we trying to include? So my sort of personal point I'll finish on is just to try and, when we say involvement, talk about public involvement and to try and move away from this consumer model in health, in democracy, in anything really. So yeah, public involvement is what I like to work.
Thank you. So the comments about legitimacy, I just wonder, and compulsory voting and choice. We talk, in a democracy, we talk about equality. One vote is equal anywhere, and we try and equalise that through the electorates, the number of votes that represent the number of people. But when you have a society that's very unequal, both financially and in all sorts of other ways, what does democracy, how does that affect democracy? Can we come at it from that angle? Steph, what do you think in terms of representation of, one vote in your electorate is equal to one vote in a city seat or...
Well, to give you a practical example, I suppose my electorate covers an area of 11,634 square kilometres. A seat like Malvern probably covers about 12, 13, 14 square kilometres. So the member for Malvern might have one public school. I would have somewhere around 50. So I do think that how you equalise that, I'm not quite certain. You can't give country people 2 votes, but in a proportional sense, there are certainly imbalances there, particularly for rural and regional populations who it's simply not possible for me to give them the same kind of representation, I believe, spanned out over such a large area with potentially a lot more issues than someone in the affluent eastern suburbs of Melbourne, most of which, I was speaking to a new member from out there recently, and he said to me in the first few months of him establishing his office, he had probably 10 people walk through the door. Now, I have 10 people a day who walk through the door, and because there is a much greater level of disadvantage in my communities, the people that I'm elected to help often can't help themselves like many of the people could in his electorate. So there are certainly issues there from my perspective in how you try to equalise those arrangements.
Can I just go to your point, I think? What you're really asking about are what are the minimum preconditions for participation in a democracy? And it's why I was suggesting that there are boundaries, and I talked a bit about what, in my work in democracy, what you could or couldn't do, and still claim the legitimacy of democracy. If you tried to claim a democratic mandate and presided over a situation in which any percentage of your community is illiterate and lacks basic education, if it doesn't have basic access to health, then the idea that you are free to vote becomes it's just a fantasy. And I think this is what you're trying to draw out. That there need to be certain preconditions that we as a community satisfy for every person who is given that democratic opportunity, that they are well enough educated and a few other basic things. This actually came up for me in a discussion with the New Zealand government where they were doing something fairly pernicious. This is ages ago. And they tried to claim that because they had been elected a government, they could do whatever they like because they enjoyed a democratic mandate. And I had to explain to them that that simply wasn't true, that there are these boundary conditions that you cannot go beyond and still have a functioning democracy, such as make people with red hair say, okay, everybody with red hair is going to be, we're going to decline them education. That's not going to be consistent.
But it seems fairly typical, doesn't it? Politicians, they get in government, they are the government, they have a mandate, they're representing the people, but their notion of representing is that they have the power to act.
They think they have an unqualified licence. And let's not be fair. Pretty much every single person I've ever met who's gone into politics has been well-intentioned, and they're not kind of selfish individuals grasping for power. I just think, like lots of us, they may not be as well informed about what it means to be a politician in a democratic polity and all of these subtleties. They just don't know about it, so they get caught up in the rhetoric.
Yeah. So, Sally, in your work, how much have you sort of learned about politicians and their understanding of the role of a politician and a member of Parliament, that sense of responsibility?
I agree that many, if not all the politicians that I study, for example, I think are well-intentioned and, in democratic terms, when you look at systems in other places, I think we're comparatively well served in terms of what our politicians or the quality of their experiences and so on. But I think for me what we're talking about here is really about the institutions and not so much the people, or you might say that's a problem, but I think the institutions are what are really underlying all the conversations we're having. Parliament, political parties, they're creaky 19th century institutions that just aren't cutting it in today's world. And I mean, political parties for me are particularly interesting. I mean, they have a vital self-interest to survive, to adapt, and yet they've done it so incredibly poorly that it's, it's politically suicidal. You can see them grasping around, trying to think, what's happening here? People are voting for minor parties, micro parties. They're delivering us hung parliaments. They're kicking us out after one term. What's going on?
Tiny membership too, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely tiny memberships. I mean, they have no real claim to political legitimacy in terms of their own internal democracy. In the Labor Party, if you join the Labor Party, I think they make you wait nearly 2 years before you can vote in an internal ballot for who you're going to want to represent you in your local area, and you're a party member. I mean, that's to avoid branch stacking and other problems, but you don't have any internal democracy in many political parties. This is a problem. This is not an institution, or these are not institutions, political parties, that are coping well with the modern world. Connected with that is policy. I mean, despite all the information we have at our fingertips, despite growth in education, we're not seeing good quality policies or solutions coming through. I mean, the world is complex, it's globalising, there are all sorts of difficulties, but you would think that policy development would be a high priority for political parties, and yet it seems that it's not. And you only have to look at federal government, for example. Again, they're grappling. They just can't get or explain or implement policies that fix problems, and this all goes to the legitimacy of the system. It needs radical structural change in these old institutions. They were developed in another era, another time. They just don't suit anymore.
Can we hold on to that notion? We'll get to the issue that Simon raised in his speech about the way forward and what can be done. I just wanted to hang on for a minute to the notion of inequality and one vote equals. Nicholas, have you got any comment on that? I mean, Thomas Piketty's book on inequality shows enormous gaps between the wealthy and the poor, apparently growing inequality. So what do you think that means for democracy?
I think it's worth kind of pondering that it's sort of paradoxical that economic inequality should drive a degradation of democracy. I think it does, but I think it's worth trying to pause a little and work out the mechanism. How does this happen? Because the poor retain their interest as poor people, the middle class, as they're called in America, retain their interest in the middle class, in their own interests. They have a vote, and yet it seems that as societies become more unequal, they become less democratic. At least as far as I can see, the engine behind that is what I call vox pop democracy, which is the medium within which democratic politics takes place is the media. Everything goes through the media. And we are now at a very advanced stage of deliberation as entertainment. There is a terrible lack of deliberation in politics. And if you're a practicing politician, firstly you focus in terms of getting your own messages out on, they used to be 45-second sound bites, then 30 seconds, they're about 5-second sound bites now. But the other thing that is an incredibly hard constraint is the sound bites that can be used against you. So you can come up with a perfectly good policy, but if in the war room coming up with it, someone comes up with a zinger line, that's the end of it.
Some zingers are better than others.
That's the absolute end of it. Well, that's right. That brings on one of my favourite programs, but that's not. I wasn't trying to refer to that at the moment. So in the United States, so the state of affairs here is really shocking. It's absolutely shocking. So in the United States, the Koch brothers, billionaires, set up astroturfed political operations to generate the most foul results, like the swift boating of John Kerry, which John Kerry, a legitimate war hero from Vietnam, that's not necessarily, that doesn't mean you should vote for him for for president, but that was managed. They managed to find a way to turn that against him. More notoriously for policy, the scientific consensus on climate change is a piece of cake in the hands of the Koch brothers and Vox Pop democracy. It's easy to turn the possibility that the scientists might be wrong, which they might be, into a bit of Vox Pop fodder. And then we have 300 million Americans who know nothing about it, with 46% or 50-something% imagining that it's worth their while having a view on climate change. I happen to think that it's entirely possible that the scientists are wrong. Scientists have been wrong about an awful lot of things, but I've almost never seen the media, and this kind of even includes the ABC, running a kind of due diligence over skeptics and saying, is this person a damn ratbag who's now making a living, or not so much making a living, but making a retirement of ill-informed scepticism, and it's easy to get on the media that way, or is this person a skeptic who should be brought to the public attention? Who cares if you're in the media? We've got a pro view, we've got an anti view, and now we have, for the first time in my memory, a government in power that came to power with a Vox Pop policy. And what I mean by that is a complete non-policy, an absurd policy, which is that they're going to meet the targets, they're not going to price carbon, they believe in markets, and they think the best way to do it is to subsidise polluters to do a bit less polluting. And the government in power now doesn't even know what an absurd millstone that is around their neck. And they haven't watched that for 11 years, John Howard, who didn't want to do anything about this, was worn down by the fact that his position in government didn't add up. And it's no good having a policy that doesn't add up if you want to be in power for a long time, because it kind of falls apart in front of your face.
I want to get a couple of the students who wanted to ask questions about the media. We've shifted a little bit from the inequality in major political parties. We can come back to that. But the issue of the role of the media in educating the public and informing the public. Jessica, is Jessica there? Jessica Bailey has a question on that.
Okay. My question for the panel. Do you think the long-term strategies of political parties is conveyed to the voting public in an understandable form? Is the media, for instance, doing this effectively enough to enable voters to make a clear decision based on their own values and beliefs? And can we trust the information we get from the mass media?
Thanks. And Sam Bolitho. Leonie, Sam Bolitho there? No? Yeah. Up the back. No?
I can just shout it out.
No. Quick. Well, Dominique. Is Dominique there? Yes. Okay, you've got the microphone up there. Could you stand up when you use the microphone so people can see you?
My question was, how much of what we hear is 100% true, and how much is manipulated to fit each particular media source's views?
Okay, and Dominique, your question's related as well, so we may as well get the mic.
Yeah, I just wanted to address the fact that in recent years, widespread use of social media has changed the way we communicate and receive information. Does the panel think that social media has affected the way we, the younger generation, view democracy? With access to such an abundance of opinions and unreliable news sources, do you feel that the idea of politics and taking an interest in government has diminished?
Okay, so three related questions about the role of the media in the press. Sally, I'm going to throw it to you, since that's particularly your area. How do you respond to that? I mean, I think it's related to the inequality thing because of the institution of its education, being informed, understanding what Nick said of, things not being explained, policies not having a rationale explained. But your comment.
Yeah, so the media, and particularly newspapers, but also commercial television and some aspects of commercial radio, they're also creaky institutions that have had their day, and they're also in chaos. Newspapers in Australia, for example, but also in other mature liberal democracies, are really nearing an end point in many ways. Their economic model has gone, and their economic model was what sustained them for so long, and it paid for the journalism. The journalism was icing on the cake to get you to read the classifieds and the ads. Now they don't have so many classifieds and ads, they can't afford to get the journalism. It's all changing and shifting very dramatically, and some of the major media organisations in this country are really struggling now. So, that's something I would say. I mean, there are noticeable changes in how the media reports politics, and when I wrote the book that Don mentioned, I had, I think, 8,000 samples of election reporting over a 10-year period. Luckily, I had a team of RAs to help me. We coded how these things were examined, policy issues, all sorts of things. We counted soundbites with stopwatches. We did all sorts of things to see how coverage had changed. You could noticeably see it changing. There was, for example, in the reporting of policy, there was a direct line downwards of a trend between how much they used to report policies, including how many they mentioned in one story, and the number of sources they would have in a story. It all just kept going down, down, down. This is an economic problem because the media have declining resources, and that's a fact. At the same time, all the stories about the process of politics, who's complaining about who, is there going to be a leadership problem, all of the meta stories were going up. You've got to write about something, right? So that's just the reality of how politics is reported now. It's changed and it's changing. So this is an issue, another issue that everybody's grappling with at the moment, and I don't think many people in the media would think that it's all sorted and great. There are clearly problems. This affects trust in the media, the same as we're talking about trust in politicians. I mean, trust in the media and trust in politicians are equally low. When you talk about journalists writing about politicians and saying, they're not trusted, journalists are equally untrustworthy in many people's minds, especially in commercial media. So these are all interrelated problems. We know in the past that there's a political group, particularly in Canberra, the way our parliament, our federal parliament operates in Canberra, it's a small place, and politically and journalistically it's a very small place. Everybody knows everybody. It operates in its own sort of system and world there. So all of this also feeds in. I mean, the stories about leadership, for example, Julia Gillard, Kevin Rudd, Abbott, Turnbull, I mean, we just see it and see it. It's kind of an ongoing theme now that's been picked up on. Now, that might be the reality of what's going on. In one sense, we get a bit more of a peek at reality sometimes now than in the past, when there were big gatekeepers who might have leaked a budget but didn't tell you about what he knew from the pub, or some of the old social norms are breaking down in journalism too, which might be a good thing. All sorts of things are happening. Social media was mentioned. That's certainly in the mix as well. But what hasn't happened yet is some sort of coherent way of bringing this all together in a way that benefits democracy. It does feel like we're living on, this is an easy cop-out to say, but it does feel like we're living in a very chaotic period where none of this is quite sorted yet. And we can identify the problems as we're doing now, but the solutions are much harder to predict. All I know is that I think we need major structural changes in some of these institutions. And not all of them are politically palatable. Like, for example, it's been proposed that we have public funded newspapers, and the newspapers are even in dire financial straits. No, we won't take any public funding, or fund some investigative journalism out of universities, or have some, that's just competition for commercial media. They're not interested in that. But all of these, there must be many possibilities, some of them politically difficult, but I think they all need to be thought through.
Yeah. Jack, have you got any comment on social media and public information and the role that plays in understanding politics?
Yes, I mean, it's three fascinating questions that we could talk all day about. I mean, I think the thing I'd focus on is the idea of sort of, in all of this, national boundaries being even more irrelevant and almost nonsensical in this kind of interconnected world. And what the internet allows is a dialogue that not only happens within a country but across countries. And I think that's but it also allows advantages. It allows politicians and people to talk to people directly without going through the media or for-profit media. I thought the question about trust was interesting as well. What do you trust? Well, I think always just keep that question in mind. And I think something like, for example, Wikipedia actually has created a place that, yes, okay, there might be inaccuracies, but that in a sense is a social media. It's everybody in the world going, let's create the best encyclopedia in the world for us to learn objectively about everything with cited sources. I mean, what a fantastic, wonderful dream. That could anyone have predicted that 30 years ago? So, and I think I could say so much, but I'll just say a little bit about the idea of, what governments are doing and why. And the idea that I'd sort of to throw into this discussion is ideology versus evidence. How often is something done because someone just thinks it's the right thing to do, and how often is something done because there's evidence that it's the best evidence we have to do it. So science is of course very evidence-based. A lot of decision-making in science is evidence-based, without getting into the fact that pharmaceutical companies aren't required to publish results from clinical trials about drugs that they're selling to us. Without getting into that, the idea of doing a randomized control trial to test your policy in government is almost a laughable idea, but why? I mean, so there's a guy called Ben Goldacre in the UK who wrote a book called Bad Science. He wrote a government paper proposing randomized control trials in government policy, and they've done it. They've done it on really boring stuff like the effectiveness of people's tax returns if you send them a letter at this point or that point. But what they're actually doing is quite a subversive thing, which is saying, well, if you think this, why? And let's just test if your idea works. And to take the idea of something like drug addicts, the addiction to drugs, there's a lot of very ideological based stances on that, whereas all the evidence suggests medicalise it, treat it as a medical condition, don't criminalise it. The whole of Portugal has successfully implemented this model. Yet people are still speaking from a place of opinion and not evidence-based. And I think what social media allows, just to sort of come full circle, is for people to just call governments out on that and just say, well, this is wrong, and to actually have a dialogue that isn't set or prescribed by for-profit media or politicians. And I think that's a hugely powerful thing.
So thanks. The question, I mean, that's an interesting comment, isn't it? To call people out, and does the social media do that? I guess something like the Arab Spring, some of the Get Up campaigns, the Your Say, Our Say type websites do that. And Nicholas, you chaired the government's task force. I wonder on the use of media and information and so on. I wonder if you got a different slant on this, because people, as Sally says, the old media are sort of dying and ineffective. So the new media are seen as a sort of new hope. But we're talking about information, and we're talking about the difference between opinion and evidence. So where do you see all of this going, I wonder?
I think we have to be careful and again just try and think carefully and follow the evidence. Yes, the social media can play an important role in identifying things that are going wrong. When things are seen to go wrong in democracies, they get fixed. There's never been a famine in a democracy, and famines are typically not about the weather or the food, they're about distribution and political bad behaviour. So yes, social media can be a constraint. Social media can also, one of the most successful users of social media in Australia is Andrew Bolt. So social media I see as actually likely to intensify, and has intensified, and has been part of the process that Sally has just documented of intensifying vox pop democracy. I like Jack's example of our policy on drugs, because when I was earlier talking about policies that are damn obvious, all the evidence points in one direction, but they are stuck in vox pop democracy because of sound bites. Drug policy is probably the biggest one. Because, for instance, there was a column written in the Herald Sun about a couple of months ago by Jeff Kennett on the New South Wales Drug Court. And he felt it necessary to apologise 3 times during his advocacy of the New South Wales Drug Court approach, which is an alternative approach and somewhat more health-based, he felt it necessary to apologise that he wasn't a softie and he wasn't a left-winger. What the hell is all that about? It's clear that it works better. And even if you didn't know the evidence, all the New South Wales drug trial is, if you think that the penal model is about punishment and seeking to have that punishment have some influence on people's behaviour, i.e. they want to avoid the punishment, then rather than lock people up for 3 years, let them out, wait till they offend again and lock them up for another 3 years, it would make sense to you, wouldn't it, to have to release them if we think they're safe on a suspended sentence, give them a hearing before a magistrate once a week, a drug test 3 times a week, counselling, all of which is cheaper than being in jail, and then tell them if they do the wrong thing a couple of times, they're back inside. Well, that's just obviously more sensible. You wouldn't even need the evidence to see that at least it's trying with the logic of the system we've already got. So why is it so hard? And I think the answer is vox pop democracy. So there is an alternative to this which has not been mentioned this morning, which is deliberative democracy, which is things like citizens' juries. And in fact, elections as the institutional underpinnings for democracy are quite recent, since the French Revolution. Before then, there were virtually no elections underpinning democracy, and there was quite a lot of democracy, for instance, obviously in ancient Athens and various other places, but also in medieval towns. And what happened there was that what typically happened is that we followed the Athenian model of selection by sortition, or grabbing some people at random, as we do with juries. And I'll stop my comment there, but it would be nice to talk quite a bit more about that in my opinion.
I want to come back to those sorts of alternatives later, and you'll have a chance to say some more about that. But I want to come to Stephanie now, because you're right in the thick of it. Where do you get your information from? How are policies developed? Is social media influential? How do you relate to the media? You know, it's an interesting issue that you face.
Well, I think one of the greatest issues that we currently have is the issue of transparency. I think the vast majority of the public don't actually understand a lot of the barter and trade that goes on behind the scenes, particularly with the traditional media and with governments or oppositions. So I guess, and I've seen it a lot, particularly through my time as a media advisor, but you'll have a newspaper, for example, that will give preferential treatment if you give them an exclusive, or the converse of that. If they don't like the way you've treated them, they will not run your story, or they'll put it on page 82 as a news brief. So, you know, I think the public aren't always aware of how much stories are shaped behind the scenes, and I do think that's a real issue. I mean, there's so much politics behind the politics of the interaction between the news media and government. To give you a little example, before the election, I was phoned by a journalist who I will not name, who levelled the most amazing accusations at me about, you know, my interaction with allegations of corruption, basically, which were being put about at the time by my political opponents. And at the end of all of these amazing things that he'd concocted, which he very easily could have verified and discovered were untrue, he said to me, "So you see, there's a lot of terrible things that I could write about you, but I won't publish them if you tell me who Spring Street Source is." Now, Spring Street Source is a coalition Twitter troll, and I said to him, "Well, I don't know who it is, but in any case, I'm not going to be blackmailed." But those things happen all the time. You know, if you're in a particularly tight spot, then you might try and find other information that you can trade off with them so they'll go easier on you. So they're relationships that the public just never really gets to see. Similarly, with social media, I have seen over the 8 or 9 years or so that I've worked around government that a story now that is reported on in the morning will not carry the media cycle through to the evening, and this is really impacting the way media organisations work. So, you know, in the morning the Premier might have gone out and made an announcement, the news would report it, the TVs would report on that in the evening. That's no longer happening. By mid-morning that story no longer has legs and it's been burnt out because it's been all over social media. So governments are now under pressure to come up with more and more and more fodder for this constantly changing and ever-evolving news cycle that we have. And as a result, I think that is really leading to knee-jerk reactions and policy being made under pressure in short periods of time to the detriment of quality long-term outcomes.
So Sally, can you sort of expand on that and explain it a bit with your whole journalism background? Who's driving it? Is it the journalists who say we've got to have a 24-hour news cycle? Is it the politicians? Is it the public? Is it people on social media? You know, I mean, what's your take on that?
I should say I don't have a background in journalism.
She writes.
Yeah, I write, but I'm symptomatic of the modern cycle. I work for The Age ostensibly because I wrote a column for them for 2 years and still do, but I've never been in the building. I've never met my editor. They could let me go at any time. So I'm the casualisation of the workforce, and I'm not trained as a journalist. I'm an academic who'll write for the media. But the point I wanted to make really was a bit more specifically about trust, because there was that question about should we trust what's in the media? Of course not. You should trust nothing, either what politicians say, what I say, what we're saying. I mean, this is one good thing about young people I think they're particularly good at is textual analysis. Consider every newspaper story a textual thing that deserves your analysis. Think, why are they telling me this? Who benefits from this story? Why are they quoting an anonymous source? Who could that be? Why have they left out that other viewpoint? What isn't in this story? You've got to approach everything like that. I mean, it sounds suspicious and paranoid, but this is the duty of a citizen. And the media particularly is ripe for it. And I think young people are naturally good at it because they're often, you're self-publishers anyway. You publish far more than, you know, I might write a column, but you probably publish stuff every day about yourself, what you've been doing, your friend. So you're publishers and you're good at that natural, you know, thinking things through about what's in here and why. So you should approach every newspaper article like that. I mean, it's time consuming, it's probably annoying, sometimes you just want to read it for its own sake, but that is the key to understanding media content, is it's often that question, which is the driving question of political science, who benefits? So in the leadership tussles, you know, there's often these anonymous sources, you can sort of go, oh, I bet you that's someone from that side. Or this, you know, sometimes there are stories in the media you think, who put that in there? I mean, how could they possibly have known about some tiny event? Someone involved in that must have rung up and given that journalist a story. Who could it be? You can often work things out, you might be wrong, but you can try and think things through, and that's active citizenship today, and I think it's incredibly important. It's part of being a democratic citizen.
Are there any questions from the students here? You're right in it, you're into social media. Is it true? Is your social media raising ideas and issues? Do you get information about politics, about the world from social media, or is it just chat? Are there any comments from anyone? Come on, be brave. We're easy. No?
You can tweet us.
Yeah, over there. There's somebody there. Yeah, you can tweet it to Jack.
I think on social media you have to seek out the politics, otherwise it's all Kylie Jenner's big lips. Like you can't find it. It won't appear unless you happen to have someone who liked it a year ago and it appears on your feed that day. I think you have to have actually sorted out. I get more of my information from liking right-wing extreme pages than I do from people who actually just come up and, you know, chit-chat during the day. And I'm a political science honours student and I still don't see it unless I've put it there. And I'm that girl that posts everything about politics. So I think that there's more likelihood that you're going to see what Kim Kardashian wore that day and you're going to see anything to do with politics unless you've actually sorted it out, which is why I wouldn't look for anything to do with politics on social media at all, ever.
Okay. Simon, any comments from that end of the table on this particular issue?
Yeah, a couple of things. As Sally says, that what you read in the media, what you encounter is constructed. Journalists will phone you up and they'd say something like, oh, well, would you say such and such? So they're just fishing for someone to give voice to what they want to say for their own reasons. And stuff that Steph's talking about happening, they'll phone you up and the most outrageous series of allegations, and then they'll publish them and they'll tell you, well, it's okay, you can respond tomorrow. So then you just add fuel. There's lots of stuff that goes on. So let me think about what devices we've developed in the past to deal with these things. So, and it sounds a bit tangential, but there might be a person called Bert Smith who goes into a corner store and asks to buy a block of chocolate. And the only question the owner of the corner store will have of Bert is, can you afford to pay the price of the chocolate, and we'll hand it over. But if exactly that same person, Bert Smith, walks into his doctor's surgery and says, I'd like to have a block of dairy milk chocolate, and the doctor knows Bert to be a diabetic, the doctor will say, no, I'm not going to collude with doing something which harms your interests. So there's something in this structure between the world of the market and the pursuit of self-interest and the sacrificing of wants, as opposed to the world of the professions where they subordinate self-interest and serve the interests of others. And what you should be looking for, what we should be looking for, is whether the media, in its traditional role, is performing the role of a profession, which doesn't mean you have to wear hair shirts and be poor, because surgeons and others do quite well, or whether or not they're just participant in the market. And if they're part of a profession, whether or not we could expect journalists not necessarily to make heroic decisions, but just to fall more on the right side of the questions than not. Because we have developed over the centuries a number of distinctions like the social compact we enter into with the professions, which are designed to regulate some of these things. And that will involve some of the changes that Sally was referring to about structure. So it may be that private trusts and foundations, like the one that owns The Guardian, will become more common, where it's not being run as a for-profit entity. It still has to be attuned to things, because it may be that information of a certain quality is required for us to make good decisions. And it won't be on social media. I mean, social media typically is pretty good at conveying emotion. It's not especially good at reason. And although it might evolve, I don't know, it could change to that. And we'll have to, I think, still go back to rely on the kind of the aids to deliberation, because as Nicola said, and I tried to imply at the beginning, our current decision-making process isn't the end of the story about what democracies can have, and there are all sorts of other models we could have, such as the deliberative democracy and juries and things, but they too are going to need reasonably good information on which to base those decisions.
Any comment, Jack?
Yes, I think first of all, thank you to Stephanie for being so open and honest about the kind of things that politicians face behind the scenes, and the more of that comes out into the open, the better. It's a really important point for everyone to remember that this is a very shaped dialogue that a lot of us experience. And thanks Sally for her point as well about don't trust anything. I mean, you're not paranoid, you're sensible, And that's what science is, and that's what conscience is, acting with knowledge. Just picking up very briefly on the point about The Guardian being a point of trust, or rather, sorry, The Guardian being run by a trust. Probably one of the most important things that's happened is the ability for people to speak out and whistleblow in a way that would have been impossible, I dare say even 10 years ago. And I'm going to just tie a couple of threads together just very quickly, but just going back to the equality question, I think equality is an aspiration. I think that's, it doesn't exist as a thing, it's an aspiration. But we're here today to discuss, is democracy working? Well, my question would be, who for? Working for who? Is it working for mining company shareholders? They might have a different answer to a room full of students who are about to be put into a lifetime's worth of debt to simply pursue their studies, which are probably of benefit to everybody. Who is it working for is the first question. Has it ever really worked? Will it work? The point is that I think democracy really, I'm going to come back and tie these threads together, I promise. We're talking about rule of law, and I think that's the really important thing for everyone to take away, is that, you know, that's the shared agreement we have as a society, as a planet even, that, you know, you balance the rights of everybody, not just some people. And if everyone isn't protected equally, then people won't value the law. And you go back to that legitimacy point made by Simon. And, you know, the rule of law is this really powerful idea, and it's upheld by holding people to account. Now, if you can't do that, you lose the legitimacy and you lose the effectiveness of democracy. What's happened in the last 10 years with the internet, and in part through social media, and I would count something like WikiLeaks as social media, if you want to have a very broad definition. You know, you've got this new space to talk about things. And yes, okay, you had all the WikiLeaks stuff come out. For example, you know, there's many examples, but the Edward Snowden one is probably one of the more famous leaks. Where was the first place he went to? It wasn't the government. It was The Guardian. And actually, what I think traditional media, or let's use The Guardian as an example, what they're becoming, and I think what they're going to have to become, are trusted outlets. They're the people who are trusted to sift and to sort and to verify, you know, which involves skill, time, talent, money. But we trust that they're doing it in a way that is in the public interest, in a way that is upholding the rule of law. And I genuinely don't think that, well, there probably have been many leaks in the past. The only reason we've heard about the Edward Snowden one is because we've all got mobile phones that are connected to the internet. We've all got this internet access, and it would have been covered up. You can guarantee it would have been covered up. You know, he's living in Russia. He's not sat at home in America with his feet up. So,
yeah, look, I sort of agree with the sentiment, but I keep thinking of Daniel Ellsberg. Now, Daniel Ellsberg did what the three people I can think of, Julian Assange, Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden did. All that information got out. It was published by the New York Times, and he didn't go to jail for one day, I don't think. These other people, Bradley Manning was essentially tortured before his trial and is in jail for who knows how long. Now, not Bradley, but what's his name now, her name now? Chelsea Manning. Julian Assange, quietly going mad, or perhaps we should say madder, in the Ecuadorian embassy in London with, is it £6 million a year spent on police outside there, and Edward Snowden in exile. So I think that's a pretty good example that we're in a lot worse state than we were.
So why has it changed? What's your argument about why it's changed?
Well, I'm only reaching out for that, and I'm not sure, but I guess my feeling is that democracy was kind of, it evolved in the 19th century, and it was grafted onto a world in which there was a strong middle class which had a very powerful ethic of respectability. It was death to a politician to become unrespectable. It was highly damaging to a politician to say something that proved to be wrong. Politicians say things that prove to be wrong kind of weekly now, and just rearrange their position. You know, Tony Abbott has had most positions on most things, and I don't. Well, it's true. I mean, he thought a carbon tax would be a better idea at one stage. The other thing is that the ethics of a middle class was able to stand up for abstract principles of democracy in the case of Daniel Ellsberg. Richard Nixon would have had to roll too many important middle class pillars of respectability to get Daniel Ellsberg in jail. And that's not the case now, because everybody wants to win the next election, and the next election will not be fought on whether Edward Snowden is in exile or not. And so we've had so essentially, in my view of this, the media and various economic formations have been feasting on the carcass of society, and they're still feasting, and it's a pretty bad situation. And Simon quoted us some fairly scary numbers about the feasting that's been done on younger people who are very firmly in a purchaser-provider model as far as democracy is concerned, and in many ways the government of Singapore, which is a perfect purchaser-provider model of government, is a better provider.
So you're really saying the pillars of middle-class respectability have declined?
They're optional.
Yeah, they're optional. So part of I think we have to link that to the whole growth of the consumerist model, don't we? It's middle-class respectability is not just money.
Nicholas is also saying, I think, that if you think that the only role that a democracy has and a government in a democracy is to provide for certain material wants, then go to Singapore where that will happen, that you can provide it. If you think
work better.
Yeah, if you think that a democracy and the government that represent is also there to embody certain ideals that you have as a society, then the mere provision of those wants will not be enough. There are interests that we have as a society that go beyond what we may say we want, which is why representative democracy, as the particular model we had, was an elegant solution for a while, because the representatives in the kind of consensus around the middle class values would not wouldn't merely do what you wanted as an electorate. They weren't there as your delegate. They were there to exercise good judgment in the service of those ideals. And of course we all want good education, we all want good health, we all want certain things, but to think that we are reducible to those things alone is to have a very diminished sense of what it means to be a person in the world.
So who in society speaks up for the good society? We lost...
It used to be politics, but that doesn't happen.
Well, it used to be politics and the church, probably.
I think Nicholas is right. There's probably a consensus around it, and there were a number of different voices, but the betrayal of the purposes through hypocrisy in each of those things, and their falling, means that there is this gap. Now, as I said, you could be pessimistic about it, or you could say, no, this is a golden opportunity to go back and have these conversations.
Let's follow through on that pessimism-optimism thing. What I'm hearing is not too optimistic at the moment. It sounds like a failure in principle, a failure of education, failure of young people seeing that there is a common good. There's only my personal good, my personal interest to be served. Where's the common good? Where does it come from? So let's talk for a minute about what you see as options. How can we regenerate that? I mean, Simon addressed this in the last part of his talk in terms of where we might go. But so, Nicholas, you can start.
Well, I'm going to try and bring up the Athenian oath on my on my smartphone. See, there's good things about smartphones and social media. So I think one of the central, perhaps it's a bit of a surprise until you sort of think about it, and then it makes sense. One of the sources of civic virtue is deliberation itself. And the experience of deliberative democracy forums is that they're extremely uplifting for virtually everybody involved. The people gain all sorts of experts who attend these, because the idea of a citizens' jury is to get a group of people together. Apparently 43 is a popular number for reasons I don't understand. And those people might spend several weeks and they have access to experts and so on. And it's remarkable how often the experts end up really admiring the process that they've been through. And the people themselves are given the role of serving the public interest, and it is something which they identify with extremely strongly. The Premier of South Australia, who's pretty interested in trying to do more of this, had a citizens' jury on how to make, has had several now, but one was on how to make Adelaide a more livable, a more vibrant city, but also a safer city at night. And he went and he milled around with the people on the citizens' jury, and they all said things to him like, the most compelling way of putting it, one person put it, he said, I didn't really come down here to talk about, I didn't really come down here because I'm so driven by the question you put to us. I came down here to see if democracy could be made to work for my children. And he thought it could. And just one other thing, before I read the Athenian Oath, if I can, if it's the right one. No, I don't know whether it is, we'll see. Is that when the organisation I'm involved in, the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, did a report on this citizens' jury, and when the members of the citizens' jury and those people who watched, those people who participated in some other way, were asked what had happened to their opinion of politicians, they'd gone up. What had happened to their opinion of bureaucrats, they'd gone up. And what had happened to their opinion of the media, which was already low, and it plummeted. Because they basically said, we've just been fed entertaining lies. These are hard problems that good people are trying to work on, and we're glad we had a go, and this is what we think, and now we carry the legitimacy of the community. Another little bit of Athens. The word we have, the Athenians had a word, idiotes, and you can work out what that means, what that's turned into in our language. But it meant somebody who was only interested in their own interests, someone who could not participate in the public polity on behalf of the public polity. And now, of course, we have the word idiot, but we don't think of it in quite the same way.
Stephanie, how do you respond to that notion of citizens' juries, the deliberative democracy notion? Do you actively do that in your own electorate?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting concept. Not that I want to do myself out of a job, of course, but I think that rural communities tend to do that a lot better in any case. They tend to be highly networked. We've seen obviously the example of Voices for Indi in recent years. I think the Nationals have had quite a strong tradition of doing that, and I think any politician worth their salt is going to go out and actually seek the opinion of the people that they represent. I mean, you'll be turfed out if you don't. There's been, I think, quite a lot of focus in this debate on the notion of politicians making promises and then subsequently breaking them, and the issues of trust that creates. I have to say, in my own experience, it's very easy to look at complex policy issues in black and white terms before, particularly as an alternative government attempting to form policy. So when you actually get into government, you often find that there are huge shades of grey between the policy and the problem, or the problem and the solution. And I think that's one of the issues. I don't think that politicians go to elections intentionally making promises that they feel they can't deliver. I think they arrive in government and discover that the problems are often far more complex than they could see from the outside, and they're living in a somewhat changing environment. In my experience, politics is like any workplace. There are wonderful people, they're genuinely intentioned trying to make positive difference, and they don't. They would never intentionally mislead people, and then there are people who are there who are somewhat self-serving and there for their own interests. It's like any workplace.
So it's the formation of policy. What's being suggested is policies can be formed in another way, not just through the party machine, because you get a very different outcome. I wonder if Sally or Jack have got a comment on that, the way policy is formed and how you see that sort of being presented.
I think it's almost inexcusable that it's not done better than it currently is done. There's that much capacity now to research, to find out. I mean, if we have a problem in this country, you can look at examples in other countries and see what's done and what's working. I mean, Jack mentioned evidence-based. We've got great capacity to do good research, good development, to think broadly, to take the best bits from other parts of the world, to look at what's worked in the past, to think creatively. We've got an incredible amount of knowledge resources and information resources. If they're not being used well, there's got to be a reason for that, and that's what we have to investigate. I mean, for me, one of the biggest problems was something smaller, perhaps, that it might seem that I mentioned before, which is young people not registering to vote. That, to me, polls might say they're dissatisfied with. If you're not registering to vote, that's a real big problem for Australian democracy. I mean, it's exactly what they want in a way. They want you not to vote and to say, I don't have any real say in this. What's it matter anyway? I can't change anything. I mean, there's a comment before about, one person's vote doesn't make any difference. Well, that only makes sense if you're that one. But if you're everybody, or if you're 1,000 or 50,000, of course it makes a difference. So, I mean, there is every rational reason to vote, especially in a system like ours. And, if young people don't register to vote, that to me is major trouble ahead. There's a good saying that I really like, which is the way most people give away their power is by thinking they don't have any. If young people get to that point, and I think Simon mentioned before, there is a point where it's going to be really difficult to turn things around. And for me, if we keep seeing voting rates or voter registration rates among young people falling away, we're heading for real trouble. And I think that needs to be turned around immediately.
See, we had 3 questions from students on exactly this issue. We're running close to time, but I wouldn't mind just getting them to express those questions. James Gales, is James there? No, not here today. What about Laura? Laura Rawlins? Okay. Laura, yep.
So my question was, why do you think young people take such little interest in politics, and how do you think it could be changed? Is it through teaching students more about the importance of politics, or by making political advertising more engaging, honest and clear?
Thank you. And Sophie. Sophie there? Yep, just in front. Sophie O'Donnell.
So my question was, there seems to be a growing disinterest between young people in politics, and what you guys thought the consequences of that might be, both kind of immediately and in the long term as well.
Yeah, so I think you've already addressed that a bit, Sally. Jack, you want to comment?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. I think they're very, very important. And I suppose to tie them both together, it would be Don's question, who's speaking for the public good? Well, my question would be, who isn't? And my challenge to everyone in this room is, if you're not speaking for the public good, well then who is? That's what democracy is. And I think part of the problem, and this is my opinion, is that we build politicians up into something they can't be and arguably shouldn't be. The levers they have as we call them public servants in the UK, I think that's a good reminder that they are public servants. They are serving the public. The levers they have are essentially making something illegal, or increasing or decreasing the taxation. But we kind of project so much more onto them that as a result, they act sometimes as if we should be seeking moral guidance or instruction from them, as if anyone actually asked them in the first place. And there's this morphing of their role. So I think to answer the question about the dissociation is that, they're almost held up as being everything to everybody, when in reality they can't do that much. I mean, a very quick example is, you're trying to control the population. Okay, but you can only really ever influence it. You can make drinking on the street illegal as a politician, but you can't realistically prosecute everyone for it. And more important and pertinent examples are things like prostitution, abortion, and assisted dying. As a politician, you can legislate, you can make laws, but you cannot stop these things from happening. And actually, it's the admission of powerlessness. And actually, I think a lot of politics is becoming statement. It's sort of saying, we're making this law as a way of saying that we don't think this is okay, or that, as a society, we think this. A very recent example, vaccination, okay? Hopefully there's no one in this room who disagrees that vaccination is a very important thing. But the government to come out and want to say that they think it's an important thing, but the only tool they have is, we're going to remove child benefit for people. Okay, you're expressing a good sentiment, which is vaccination is good. is the way you've done it the best way, or would it be education or public health interventions? So I think it's recognising that there's only really two levers: taxation or making it illegal that these politicians have got, and we're expecting probably too much. So just to conclude, I think for some people, voting is just the deference of blame, deferring the blame, shifting and delegating the accountability to others from themselves, which in some cases is practical. We can't ask everyone what everyone thinks about traffic calming measures. That doesn't work. But I think the problem is when people also shift and delegate spiritual and moral aspects of society, and that's inexcusable. And I think really, just to quote a song, inaction is a weapon of mass destruction. It's a good one. Be the change you want to see. Do something. Don't wait for someone else to do it. Politics is not going to answer that question. So I think that would be my answer to young people, is recognise the limitations and do something yourself.
I'll give you another quote, Jack, on that. Voltaire said once, "Every man is guilty of all the good he did not do." You're facing this, you're looking for people to vote, you want young people to be interested. What's your response?
Well, just very quickly, I think young people aren't stupid, and there's a real search for meaningful engagement, which, a lot of the, I think, problems that have been articulated around the news cycle and that relationship between media and politics often reduces the way politicians speak to people, and it always comes down to the lowest common denominator. So we lack a meaningful discourse on issues that young people care about. I think there's been a very clear trend over the last 4 or 5 years in particular to adopt US campaign-style techniques here, and they're really resonating with people. Nicholas Rees, the former State Secretary of the Victorian Labor Party, alluded to it in a op-ed that he wrote following the state election last year, where he spoke about the increased use of data and analytics to drive home the Labor Party's message at the last election. Now, at a time when young people in particular, I think, are searching for that meaningful engagement, political parties are increasingly tending towards using focus group and polling to hone a message specific to your concerns. And there was a student earlier who raised the issue around having to search out political opinions on your social media feed, that they don't really pop up on your social media feed. But again, in those interests of transparency, I think many people don't actually realise how much their footprint is traced and tracked in order to understand to the nth degree what their views and preferences are, so that they can be marketed at, basically. So, I think, again, it comes back to, like rural communities do so well, face-to-face interaction with people, and, showing people that as a politician you are actually a human being and you experience the same things that everybody else does. I think that, for me, is one of the ways that, I find a lot of young people haven't even been asked whether they're interested in being involved politically, and they often have a very positive response when they are. So I think a lot of it it comes back to that, just engagement at a face-to-face level.
Simon, you wanted to say something?
I'll pick up on the point, Steph's observation about, and it's very hard to generalise about people, but my experience with younger people in Australia is that they are every bit as idealistic as any generation before them. In fact, if anything, they've got a much higher degree of engagement around this concept of meaning. But where they find it more difficult is, I think, that they are perhaps less hopeful about the capacity to do things. Now, you're a good example of somebody who has got involved in it, but I remember getting into a cab here in Melbourne, coming in from the airport, and a total stranger, jumped into the cab next to me and said, "I just want to talk to you." They spotted me from somewhere and said, there's this world I'm living in, it was around climate and this and that, and said, "But I can't do anything about it, and I feel bad about that, but what I've decided to do is to focus on what I can affect, which is the local. I can do it with amongst my friends, some peer groups and things like that." My view is that one of the nastiest things our society has done is to tell people to be realistic. I'm a pragmatic idealist, and I think it's okay to be idealistic. You've got to have your feet on the ground and work that out. But the hope that you can make a difference, and it's not a vain one. We know the world does change by decisions that people make, sometimes a whole lot of little decisions amounting to quite considerable changes. So what I'm hopeful for in myself is that all of these incredibly idealistic younger people with the view that they can make a difference will actually keep broad horizons and realise that that's possible. And that's why I think that when people go into politics, Jack, it's more that they have more things than just the levers of taxes and laws. I think the exemplary role that you can play by having a go and caring about it in a way that it's not just a machine, but you really care about the substance of the things you do, that also carries a message in itself.
Yeah, terrific. Now, I think we're going to have to wind up, and I'd like to get each of the panel members to sort of comment on the overall discussion. We've missed various things. We didn't talk enough about the major parties versus the minor parties and the role of independents. We haven't talked enough, I guess, about freedom of speech, which I see as a major issue. You know, how much do we all agree with Voltaire's statement, "I do not agree with what you have to say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it"? It's a huge issue in a democracy, which we haven't had time really to tackle. But given the feeling of the discussion, Simon's speech, your own perspective, can we start with Nicholas in a sort of rounding up comment?
I will make a rounding up comment by reading the Athenian Oath.
How long is it?
You'll have to find out. Just hang on. We will never bring disgrace on this city by an act of dishonesty or cowardice. We will fight for the ideals and the sacred things of the city, both alone and with many. We will revere and obey the city's laws, and we will do our best to incite a like reverence and respect in those above us who are prone to annul them or set them at naught. We will strive unceasingly to quicken the public sense of civic duty. Thus, in all these ways, we will transmit this city not only not less, but greater and more beautiful than it was transmitted to us.
I don't think I can sum it up better than that. But if I could just leave you with one quick statistic that goes back to this whole conversation about the interaction of social media and media. There was a study done in the US a few years ago which showed that in 2000 the average attention span of a human being was 12 seconds. In 2013 it was 8 seconds, which is 1 second shorter than a goldfish.
Your time's up.
I was out at 3 seconds.
But how would you sum that up, Stephen?
Sally.
Democracy's never been perfect, it never will. It's a relationship, especially representative democracy. It's a representative and the people, it's a link. It's only going to be as good as you can make it, and it requires constant work and tinkering and thought.
Terrific.
I'd echo that, yeah, keep questioning. And I was lucky to hear Tony Benn speak, and I asked him a question once, a British politician, does he think that the internet's going to change democracy and how? And he said, no, not really, no. He just said he thinks it will make it easier to connect people together who are trying to do something. Well, I think that's a very powerful thing. And I'd say if you believe that something possible is impossible, then it becomes so. So, just whether it's local and you're doing something, national or international, the international dream of banning nuclear weapons. If you visit Hiroshima, they'll have a mayor's conference there, and I said, I don't think you'll achieve anything. No one's going to get rid of nuclear weapons. He says, yeah, but if everyone thinks that, then we'll never get rid of them. And I kind of went, huh. And so, be the change you want to see. do something.
Thank you. Simon, last word.
On a bookend on Nicholas. So a year or so ago, we wrote an update of a pledge around politics, which is like the Athena one. I'll just read the beginning of it because in the New South Wales election, without any prompting, we ran it, and we had 250 odd candidates all agree to the propositions and make this promise. At the beginning of it, so it's a bit like Nicholas's Athena one. This is how it reads, but it captures something of the temper of today. As originally conceived, the practice of politics is intended to be a noble calling, the arena within which a citizen might contribute to the establishment and maintenance of a good society. Yet, without voluntary ethical restraint, the pursuit and exercise of power risks becoming personal, brutal and self-serving, coarsening the polity, bringing public institutions into disrepute and damaging the common weal. And then it says makes a series of commitments to stop that happening.
Fantastic. Laura, you're going to thank our panel on behalf of the rest of the audience. Thank you.
So, on behalf of University College, Edward and I would like to thank all the panel members for coming today and providing us with some very thought-provoking discussion. It's a privilege to hear from people with such extensive knowledge on the topic of democracy. So, we just have some gifts we'd like to present now. Thank you.
That's for Patricia, who organises these forums with me every year. That was a surprise, wasn't it? I was thinking, which one of the ladies up here is getting the flowers? Thank you very much.